I'm very pleased and very honored to welcome Professor Nico Stehr to the University of Lethbridge, and particularly to the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy. And I just want to emphasize that this is the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy, nothing to do with any premiers or any politicians, nothing like that. So we're separate, we're neutral, just make sure about that. And anybody who's affiliated with the Prentice has been asked, please make that distinction. So here I am being a role model. Okay, I'd like to just introduce Nico Stehr briefly, and then mention a couple of quick other things. I'm asked to mention that there are two upcoming, at least for now, two upcoming talks. We can't pass this around because you've got it nailed down.
Right.
So, given that it's nailed down, I'll tell you. There's one on October 16th, a brown bag for the Prentice Institute. Trevor Harrison's going to talk about the real and the abstract thoughts on Greece and Turkey, which will certainly be quite contemporary. And then Peter Kellett, who's right here, is going to talk about his PhD research on unveiling a socio-demographic portrait of Canadian men's depression. And of course, that's a very important contemporary topic. So I hope you can come for that. That is the 14th of November. And these are posted everywhere. The Nancy Broadcasting System is very good at this, so they're everywhere. Okay, Nico Stehr, Professor Stehr, is Karl Mannheim Professor of Cultural Studies at Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen, Germany, which is right on Lake Constance. I was lucky enough to be invited there for a small symposium. It's beautiful. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a fellow of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. His research interests center on knowledge societies. In fact, he is the leader in the world on sociology of knowledge. That is a fact. That's not just my claim. And he is also very interested in the societal consequences of climate change, and he's been writing on that for many decades, so he really is a leader on the sociology of climate change. He's the author of gazillion books, and one of the authors of the Hartwell Commission papers on climate policy in Europe, which have been quite well received and gotten a lot of press. I don't want to get booted in the behind here by a door opening. Among his recent English book publications are, I'll just read a few because there are very many, Biotechnology Between Commerce and Civil Society in 2004, Knowledge, total title of the book, which shows his prominence, Knowledge in 4 volumes, which came out with Routledge, Moral Markets with Paradigm Publishers, 2008, Who Owns Knowledge, Knowledge and the Law, Knowledge and Democracy, Society, that's the sole title, Climate and Society, that came out in 2010, The Knowledge and Power of Expertise, The Power of Scientific Knowledge. It goes on and on and on. Our library has quite a number of his books. Some of them are in German, some of them in English. So he really is Mr. Sociology of Knowledge and Mr. Sociology of Climate Change in the world. I just want to mention one thing, that a measure of his stature in the field is that he was invited by the very prestigious journal Nature, in which you've published several articles, I think, on sociology of climate change. He was invited to do a pre-publication book review of Naomi Klein's brand new book, it's just out this week, on climate change and capitalism, and I guess she has some personal reflections in there too. Well, most of us haven't read it because it just came out, so he's privileged. But Nature invited him, went to him to get that review, which I think is quite a measure of it, of his stature. I just want to say that I've known him practically my whole life, really, because when I was a wee slip of a PhD student, I took a course with him. Little did I know, well, it was very inspiring, and little did I know that many years later, 13 years later or something, I would return to the University of Alberta as a full professor and be a colleague of his. So we were colleagues for a couple of years. In fact, we were 2 of the 4 fellows of the Royal Society of the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta for some years. Now no one is left there who's a fellow of the Royal Society. He and I both left, and at least I stayed in Alberta. And he moved to Germany, and one colleague died, and another one moved to the UK. So there are no fellows of the Royal Society in the Sociology Department anymore. But here we are. So he's had a big influence on my life. I totally respect him. He's inspired me, and I think this is interesting to have him here. You're welcome. Very welcome here.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for your kind words and introduction.
Indeed, we have known each other for many years, and it was always a pleasure to know you, and I think this will continue, I hope, for many years to come. I'm going to talk about exceptional circumstances, climate policy, knowledge, and governance. And before I do so, perhaps it might be in order or of interest to you to let me offer a few words how I came to engage the issue of climate change or climate in the first place. This interest goes back some 20 years. Not that I was really interested in climate or climate change. I'd written a book called Practical Knowledge, which was an attempt to show what scientific knowledge has to look like in order to be useful in practice. At one time, I contemplated to call the book Keynes and Freud, but I quickly discovered that Freudian ideas were so controversial that I really would not have been able to demonstrate their effectiveness. So the book then focuses almost exclusively on John Maynard Keynes and his economic theory, and why his economic theory was at one time so powerful that he deserved the label the savior of capitalism. And of course also why Keynesian economic policies, not long afterwards, were fairly insignificant and did not really work as well as they once did, especially after the Second World War. But I was always convinced that what I had written about the social sciences, and economics in particular, also applied without really any major exception to the natural sciences. The very same conclusions I reached about economics I felt applied to the natural sciences. So I tried to figure out if I was to go write another book focusing on natural science knowledge and its effectiveness in practice or lack of effectiveness, I had to do a case study of one of the natural sciences. And it occurred to me I had to choose a field where I could reach the research front in a hurry, where I didn't have too much time to learn the discipline or the field. And so that's how I stumbled across climate science, which two decades ago was not really, I think, an established discipline. At least it was fairly young. And so I went to the Max Planck Institute for Climate Science in Hamburg for a couple of times as a visitor in order to observe climate scientists, more or less as if I was an anthropologist, observing a strange tribe. But it turned out that these climate scientists were in turn so eager and interested in what I was doing that they began to draw me into their work. And one climate scientist in particular, quite a famous climate scientist, with whom I've collaborated for almost 2 decades now, was a particular interest in a sociologist, in a strange tribe of a sociologist. So from then on, we collaborated. I've written many joint papers and have argued vigorously how important it is for climate science to become a genuine interdisciplinary enterprise, combining both social science imagination and physics and some other natural science disciplines which make up the field of climate science. So that's how I came to engage more directly in issues related to climate change, climate policies, and as I said, many publication books and articles, both in natural science journals and social science journals, are the result of our collaboration. Actually, we're thinking about the 20th anniversary celebration of some sort. I'm not so sure how we can do this, but our collaboration, one of the few genuine collaborations I know of between a natural scientist and a social scientist, which has lasted as long, and where both have profited enormously, learning from each other.
You're talking about Hans Storch?
Yeah. Hans von Storch, who may be known to those who are in climate science as one of the prolific climate scientists, contemporary climate scientists. So that's how I came to it in the first place, and that's not insignificant because sociologists at the time, and even today, rarely display any serious interest, paradoxically, in the issue of climate change and climate science. And we've written an article some time ago with some British sociologists and have tried to analyze why sociologists seem to be so disinterested or not engaged with issues pertaining to climate science. Anyway, that's a small history of why a sociologist who usually is working on altogether different kinds of issues became interested in climate change and continues to do so. And today, mainly in the issue of what I call climate democracy, namely how will modern societies, cope with the likely consequences of climate change. There is very little, if any, research on this very issue, because climate scientists, as I will mention in a moment as well, climate scientists have mainly been preoccupied with establishing the phenomenon of climate change. Now that this has been accomplished, I think attention really, both in the climate science community and elsewhere, ought to shift to the question of what is to be done in light of potential and likely, and as some argue, exceptional circumstances. So let me begin by repeating that the title of this lecture refers to a growing discussion in the climate science community, but also beyond, in the media, and all those who are interested, for whatever reason, in climate change, to the emergence of exceptional circumstances. For example, the end of civilization or the world as we know it. And this focus may be found especially in considerations about the governance of climate change in the coming decades. In these debates, the appeal is to the strong probability of exceptional circumstances modern societies are bound to face unless direct and immediate action is taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world. Now, it's no secret, and this is not the topic of my presentation, it is no secret that the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emission has utterly failed. Emissions continue to rise and will continue to rise in the next decade or more. So what is of interest, to me at least, is that the appeal to exceptional circumstances justifies, as far as I can see, two basic assertions, namely that of an inconvenient mind and that of an inconvenient democracy. These deficits, inconvenient mind and inconvenient democracy, in turn allow for and tolerate, on the one hand, fundamental doubts about the efficacy of democratic governance to cope with exceptional circumstances, and on the other hand, allow for and tolerate doubt about the sanity of modern citizens. The following response by Robert Stavins, director of Harvard's Environmental Economics program and a co-author of the IPCC, Working Group 3, exemplifies the case at hand. As is perhaps well known, the IPCC Working Group 3, their report presented in Berlin in April of this year, recommends to policymakers that time is very short before we lock the Earth and the social system into a future likely to produce disastrous damages. I quote, Stevens, this bottom-up demand, which normally we always want to have and rely on in representative democracy, is, in my view, unlikely to work in the case of climate change, as it has for other environmental problems. And he continues, it is going to take enlightened leadership, leaders that take the lead. Now, social scientists and others at the time of the creation or the establishment of the social sciences, professional social sciences during the early 19th century and later, took observations about the future of economic, political, and social conditions to be part and parcel of genuine social science discourse. So reflections about the future were simply taken for granted as part of professional social science discourse. However, there came a time after World War II when social scientists retreated, as Norbert Elias called it, into the present, widely abandoning reflections about the past and the future. However, we are confronted with a new situation, I think. Climate change is locked in, whatever the deniers may say. The discussion of climate change in the scientific community during the past decades can be summed up as follows. Most of the scientific discourse has been devoted to establishing, as I said, the phenomenon. Now that the phenomenon has been established, discussion, as the last IPCC report also demonstrates, focusing on ways of averting or reducing the impact of climate change. Still in the doghouse of the climate change discussion are adaptation and significantly governing or coping with the future consequences of climate change. Some of the questions that arise in the context of the latter, governing and coping, are the focus of this brief presentation. Now, in the context of many situations in everyday life, in modern society, the layperson has but few encounters with or searches for novel knowledge that prompts the actor to critically reflect on the validity of the claim or question the authority and expertise of those who advance this claim, for example, in the field of health, nutrition, or education. It is, of course, not unusual that conflicts do emerge in such everyday contexts and searches for knowledge, but such conflicts tend to be exceptional. In the end, such conflicts are resolved by appealing to the normality of the case, for example, the overwhelming evidence under dispute. In the case of climate change, especially, its likely consequences, we're confronted with entirely different assertions, except for reference to singular historical events, for example, war. There are no normal experiences to which the claims of the climate science community can appeal, as would be the case in evidence-based medicine. Concerning the consequences of climate change, because they refer to a time scale and to massive societal transformations that are beyond the imagination of most people in everyday life, and their existential conditions, even extraordinary everyday conditions. So I will advance my argument, given the background of these observations, in a number of steps. First, I will address the relation between scientific knowledge and politics. Second, I will refer to those voices ready in the past to sacrifice democratic rights and liberties in the face of urgent societal problems. So in other words, in that respect at least, the discussion about extraordinary, exceptional circumstances and the impact this has on the status of science is not entirely new, as I will show. Turning to the present, I will describe, third, the growing sentiment of an inconvenient democracy, rather than merely an inconvenient mind, which would refer to the gap between the public's knowledge about climate change and its reluctance to act or urge or engage in action. Finally, fourth, how is the impatience with democracy justified? And finally, what are some of the more obvious, at least to me, obvious faults of the assertion of an inconvenient democracy? Let me begin with self-referential observations from the scientific community. In a different historical context, of course, decades ago, the prominent economist Friedrich Hayek pointed to a paradoxical development. For as science advances with respect to the relation between knowledge and liberty, scientists and others labor under the illusion that the volume of our ignorance is steadily diminishing as knowledge advances. Hence, the observation that tends to strengthen the view that we should aim, and I quote Hayek, that we should aim at more deliberate and comprehensive control of all human activities. Hayek pessimistically adds, it is for this reason that those intoxicated by the advance of knowledge so often become the enemies of freedom. Second, and in a related observation, I referred to Isaiah Berlin, who comments that if those who disagree with oneself were only more enlightened, that is, prepared to take on board the, quote, objective framing of options, those individuals and groups would pursue the same course of action. As Berlin therefore stresses, such a state of affairs, quote, renders it easy for me to conceive of myself as coercing others for their own sake, in their, not in my, interest. I'm then claiming that I know what they truly need that what they truly need better than they know it themselves. It follows, we are, and all others who share our convictions, at liberty to suppress the liberties of those who are not thinking and acting the way they should. Third, in the words of Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, probably the most prominent German climate scientist and the advisor of the German Chancellor on issues relating to climate change, and I quote him from an interview he gave recently in Der Spiegel. He says, my own experience and everyday knowledge illustrates that comfort and ignorance are the biggest flaws of human character. This is a potentially deadly mix. In other words, and in contrast to Berlin's observations, there is little hope that the mass of citizens can be persuaded to follow the course of scientific-based policies option because the large majority of citizens is simply inclined to act irrationally. And finally, there is indeed the appeal to extraordinary circumstances that necessitates the suspension of freedoms and the political assent of climate scientists. Evelyn Fox Keller, prominent, I guess, American sociologist, for example, makes a strong case for an immediately effective political role of climate science, given the seriousness of the problem of global warming. I'll give you the quote at the moment, but it might be helpful if I at least add a footnote pertaining to the assertion about immediately effective knowledge. What joins virtually all of those in climate science and elsewhere who argue strongly for an inconvenient democracy and who appeal to governments and states and international organizations to quickly and promptly implement the recommendations, for example, IPCC, is the assertion that knowledge is immediately performative, that you can immediately deduce or translate knowledge into political action, and that not much happens in between as knowledge is translated into action. So knowledge is immediately performative or productive, if you like. Now, Evelyn Fox Keller indicates there is no escaping our dependence on experts. We have no choice but to call on those in this case climate scientists, of course, who have the necessary expertise. Furthermore, for the particular tasks of getting beyond our current impasse, that's just another common assertion. I won't use the phrase of a prominent American scientist who sums up the dilemma, the present dilemma, or current impasse in no uncertain terms. Fox, I also suggest that climate scientists may be the only ones in a position to take the lead. And given the tacit contract between scientists and the state, which supports them, on the other, I will also argue that climate scientists are not only in a position to take the lead, but also that they are obliged to do so. Now, throughout modern history, indeed, one encounters many assertions about a withering away of politics and the substitution for the reign of power of man over man and woman over woman with the authority of scientific knowledge. Without identifying himself with the position in question, the economist Frank Knight refers to a naive positivistic conception of the relation between scientific knowledge and societal problems that is repeated time and again, also in the context under discussion. Quote, science has demonstrated its capacity to solve problems, and we need only understand that those of the social order are of the same kind. Now, with the emergence of urgent global environmental problems, a new or for that matter, an established vision for the role of scientific knowledge in political governments or in political governance is invoked. The grand vision of the new political role of scientific knowledge is, among the same observers, linked to a broad disenchantment about the practical efficacy of democracy. That is, the conviction that the public is unable to comprehend the nature of the problems faced by humankind, but also a misconception about the societal role of knowledge, in particular scientific knowledge. As a result, convictions expressed about the fundamental deficiency of democratic governance in light of the profound problems humankind faces must deal with stand in contradiction to another form of alarm and strong doubt expressed about the threats to democracy, namely the dangers posed by the authority of experts and the power of experts. That is, from the very experts who warn humankind and policymakers about the dangers to modern society as a result of global warming. Now, here are some examples and a brief genealogy of influential voices in the scientific community expressing doubts about democracy in light of the potential threats of climate change. A person who may be known to many of you who recently died, the English Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, expressed a general skepticism toward democracy. For example, expressed doubts about the effectiveness of democratic states solving complex global problems such as global warming. Thereby he joins a growing chorus of critical voices, certain that democratic societies are unable to effectively and timely attack environmental problems. There is a parallel justification for the power of superior knowledge and the legitimacy of decisions supported by and derived from such knowledge. Part of the justification is, for example, a specific understanding of the function of the institution of the state. Emile Durkheim, famous French sociologist, refers to this convergence of political legitimacy and knowledge when he remarks, if the state does no more than receive individual ideas and volitions to find out which are more widespread and in the majority, as it is called, footnote, the German Chancellor rules exclusively by public opinion polls. So she does exactly what Durkheim argues the state shouldn't do. I guess your new premier probably also rules by opinion polls, I would suspect. It can bring no contribution, talking about the state of Durkheim, of course, it can bring no contribution truly its own to the life of society. And he concludes that the role of the state, in fact, is not to express and sum up the unreflective thoughts of the mass of the people, but to superimpose on this unreflective thought a more considered thought, which therefore cannot be other than different. Now, contemporary considerations in the 1920s and 1930s about science and the adequacy and capacity of democratic governance to cope with both the rapid advance of scientific knowledge, the accumulation of urgent social problems, the spread of totalitarian governments, and the rapid rise of the complexity of the world as a result of the growing size of the population, very much resonate with today's discussion about global environmental problems and the capacity of democracy to adequately respond. Sometimes some scientists in those days, and not surprisingly, the forerunners of Eric Hobsbawm, that is not only Marxist, were prepared to accept, even urge, a stronger regulation of society in the face of massive social and economic problems, and hence were prepared to sacrifice democratic rights. Karl Mannheim, by the way, also added his voice to the chorus of those who were prepared to limit, for the sake of the well-being of society, democratic liberties. Today, activists, climate scientists, politicians, and many other observers agree that the recent climate summits, Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Warsaw, were failures. The summits did not result in a new global agreement to cope with the emissions of greenhouse gases. In the aftermath of these failures, a couple of issues gained traction that both address the status of democratic governance in modern society. The first issue concerned the role of climate change knowledge in political deliberations about climate policy. Can science tell us what to do? The strong desire to reach specific policy outcomes spelled out by the scientific community leads scientists to at least sympathize with the suspension of democratic process. The second, more implicit issue concerns the relationship between democracy and time. Is democracy and are its societal institutions that are governed by the principles of liberty, such as the market, capable of dealing with harms and risks to society that are clearly located in the future? That is referring to the future present a couple of decades down the road. Political theory has been noticeably silent on this theme about democracy and time. However, we can glean some insights into these questions via the work of the renowned American economist and political scientist Charles Lindblom, who examined the interrelations between knowledge, markets, and democracy. These interrelations are just as relevant today, not just because of the serious effects of the recent financial and economic crisis. As is well known, the supposed virtues of a free market can easily be questioned. Many thoughtful and informed observers are skeptical toward an unrestricted market or are self-consciously opposed to the concept of a liberal market. But much less common, however, is an open and explicit expression of doubt about the virtues of democracy, with the obvious exception of certain leaders of decidedly undemocratic nations. In particular, it has traditionally been the case that scientists rarely have raised serious misgivings in public about democracy as a political system, most surely not in post-war Germany. I just cannot imagine that any of the significant climate scientists in Germany would raise their voice and would explicitly question democracy. However, that they are doing it much less explicitly, I'll show you in a moment. But times are changing. Within the broad field of climatology and climate policy, one is able to discern growing frustration with the virtues of democracy and a mounting appeal to exceptional circumstances. The impatience with democracy goes hand in hand with a change in the function of IPCC. Increasingly, IPCC no longer considers itself a scientific organization with a mandate to offer alternative policy options for political discussion and decision, but as a body demanding that options for political action it identifies be realized. It is the hope that an appeal to extraordinary circumstances, that is, to a threat to the very existence of humankind, alone might be able to give capacity and energy back to a failing or hampered political will, as a political scientist from France argues. It is not just a deep divide between knowledge and action that is at issue, but it is an inconvenient democracy. An inconvenient democracy that is seen by a growing number of observers as the culprit, holding back political action on climate change. But as a climatologist and geographer, Mike Hume, who is also one of the co-authors of the Hardware paper on an alternative climate policy, as Mike Hume has noted, it can indeed be frustrating to learn that citizens have minds of their own and that climate politics is a political field. Leading climate scientists insist that humanity is at a crossroads. A continuation of present economic and political trends leads to disaster, if not a collapse of human civilization. To create a globally sustainable way of life, we immediately need, in the words of the German climate scientist I already mentioned, Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, quote, a great transformation. That, of course, is a metaphor taken from Polanyi. But what the statements, we need a great transformation, exactly means is more than vague, and of course exemplifies the difficulty a German scientist has in questioning the virtue of democracy. Part, if not the core, of the required great transformation is a new political regime and forms of governance. For example, as expressed by the Australian scholars Shearman and Smith in their book, The Climate Change Challenge and the Failure of Democracy, quote, we need an authoritarian form of government in order to implement the scientific consensus on greenhouse gas emissions. Again, nothing but a statement about the immediately performative power and authority of scientific knowledge. Clearly, therefore, as the two, Sherman and Smith conclude, quote, humanity will have to trade its liberty to live as it wishes in favor of a system where survival is paramount. Another Australian scholar, Mark Beeson, argues and agrees with Sherman and Smith and adds forms of good, authoritarianism, whatever that is, forms of good authoritarianism in which environmentally unsustainable forms of behavior are simply forbidden. I wonder if that also means citizens of Lethbridge will no longer be able to drive around in a car. Forms of good authoritarianism in which environmentally unsustainable forms of behavior are simply forbidden may become not only justifiable, but essential for the survival of humanity in anything approaching a civilized form. The conclusion can only be present political conditions in China, especially the strong state, ought to become exemplary and attain global significance, as some of you may remember the column, as the important or significant New York Times columnist Friedman, author of The Flat Earth, recently observed. The well-known climate researcher James Hansen, who first alerted the American Congress to the phenomenon global warming adds frustrated, as well as vaguely, quote, the democratic process does not work. In The Vanishing Face of Gaia, James Lovelock emphasizes that we need to abandon democracy in order to meet the challenges of climate change head-on. We are in a state of war. In order to pull the world out of its lethargy, the equivalent of a global warming speech, quote, nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat will do. So the dominant political approach among important, significant voices in the climate science community, in the media, and elsewhere, concentrates almost to the exclusion of other forms and conditions of action on a single effect that governance ought to achieve, namely a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. By focusing on the goals of political action rather than its conditions, how do we reach a desirable policy and implement a desirable policy which reduces greenhouse gas emissions globally? By focusing on the goals of political action rather than its conditions, the contentious issue of climate change is reduced to a scientific or technical issue from a socio-political point of view, and this is always a complicated word for me, depoliticization of climate change and the politicization of climate science. As Sheila Yazanov asserts, the support for such a conversion comes with the societal ascendancy of science and technology generally. Matters relevant to the public have been permanently taken out of politics. Another significant outcome of the depoliticization of climate discourse is to move to a more or less, or insist more or less openly and declare that the social sciences are irrelevant to climate discourse, or what is about the same, climate scientists practice social science. So I come to the final part, but I want to give you one illustrative example of the extent to which climate science now, or climate sciences, tend to appropriate social science discourse, not only because so many social sciences are not interested, but also because climate scientists believe they are the better social scientists. When I was in the Max Planck Institute, Klaus Hasselmann, one of the leading oceanographers who came up with some profound theories and models of climate change, became interested, perhaps based on some of our conversations, that it might be helpful to couple, as climate scientists call it, to couple climate and economic models. So he said, well, what we'll do, we'll invite all the economists from the University of Hamburg to come to the Max Planck Institute, and I will explain to them what I would like to do. I would like to collaborate with you, and I would like to reach a way of coupling climate models and economic models. And the economists listened to Hasselmann and got up and said, no, we're not interested. So Hasselmann said, well, too bad, then I'll have to do it. So that's an illustration of climate scientists recognizing that the social sciences may have something to offer, but since they rarely are terribly interested in interdisciplinary work, climate scientists increasingly decide that they'll do the necessary social science themselves. Now, what that means, I try to illustrate, namely that the discussion is reduced to a technocratic kind of problem, focusing on particular goals of political action rather than the conditions which may need enlightenment about realizing such outcomes. So what exactly prompts critics of democratic governance to issue these radical calls for political change? Here is my summary and critique. First, we are informed that the robustness and the consensus in the science community about human-caused climate change has in recent years not only increased in strength, but that a number of recent studies point to far more dramatic and long-lasting consequences of global warming than previously thought. Moreover, it is highly likely that the sophistication and the depth of our knowledge about global and regional climates will substantially increase in the next decades. Under such circumstances, how is it possible? Many scientists ask that such evidence does not motivate political action in societies around the world. Second, the still dominant line of attack to climate policy shows little evidence of success. The typical approaches ruling in climate policies today show little evidence of success. One result of the recent global recession may well have been an unintended reduction of the increase of CO2 emissions. But the worldwide reaction to the economic crisis, as we all know, most recently during the G20 meeting in Australia, however, shows very clearly that governments do not conceive of a reduction in the growth of their wealth, of their populations, as a useful mechanism toward a reduction of emissions. On the contrary, everything is set in motion worldwide aimed at a resumption of economic growth. And jump-starting the economy means, of course, emissions will rise again. Thirdly, the discussion of options for future climate policy support the impression that the same failed climate policy must remain in place and are the only correct approach. It is simply that these policies have to become more effective and rational. It follows that international negotiations must lead to an agreement for concrete but much broader emission reduction targets. Only a super Kyoto can help us. But how the noble goal of a comprehensive emission reduction can be practically and politically achieved remains in the fog of general declarations of intent and only sharpens the skepticism of scientists. Fourthly, in the architecture of the reasoning of the impatient critics of democracy, one notes an inappropriate fusion of nature and society. The uncertainties that the science of the natural processes, climate, claims to have eliminated is simply transferred to the domain of societal processes. That's why, or that happens when climate scientists become social scientists as well. Consensus on facts, it is argued, should motivate a consensus on politics. The constitutive uncertainties of social, political, and economics situations or contexts are treated as minor obstacles that need to be delimited as soon as possible, of course with a top-down approach. Fifth, the discourse of the impatient scientists privileges hegemonic players such as world power states, transnational organizations, and multinational corporations. Participatory strategies are rarely in evidence. Likewise, global mitigation has precedence over local adaptation. Global knowledge triumphs over local knowledge. However, societal trends appear to operate exactly in the opposite direction. Wait until Thursday when the Scots will have voted. The ability of large institutions to impose their will on citizens is declining. As a result, people mobilize around local concerns and efforts, including those of the consequences of climate change, thereby enhancing the democratic governance. Finally, the sum of these considerations is the conclusion that democracy itself is inappropriate and that the slow procedures for implementation and management of specific policy-relevant scientific knowledge leads to massive unknown dangers. The democratic system designed to balance divergent interests has failed in the face of this threat. According to the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, all of this is about nothing less than a betrayal of the planet. and for his colleague Thomas Friedman, whom I already mentioned, evidence that the authoritarian state of China presents a model to be admired and perhaps copied. So let me conclude by saying proponents of the thesis of an inconvenient democracy tend to draw the wrong conclusion, namely that only authoritarian political states, guided by scientists, of course, make effective and correct decisions on the climate issue. History teaches us the opposite, that the opposite is the case. Therefore, today's China cannot serve as a model. Climate policy must be compatible with democracy. Otherwise, the threat to civilization will be much more than just changes to our physical environment. In short, the alternative to the abolition of democratic governments as the effective response to the societal threats of global warming that likely will be associated with climate change is more democracy and the worldwide empowerment and enhancement of knowledgeability of individuals, groups, and movements that work on environmental issues. If I add a footnote to that, this is precisely the topic on which we have started to work under the heading of climate democracy. Not that I can claim that I have answers, except to be convinced that the solution to coping with the consequences of global warming is not less, but more democracy. But how this exactly looked like, at least a sketch, if you're interested, you can find in the first Hardwell paper, which argues for an entirely different climate policy, driven not by the conventional goals of CO2, reducing CO2 emissions, but which operates under an entirely different heading, a pragmatic, well understood and probably well supported goal around the world, namely human dignity. The goal is to enhance human dignity, and the indirect outcome of enhancing human dignity, spelled out there what that means in the Hardwell paper, will perhaps be a way of coping and adapting to the consequences of climate change. So I simply recommend, if you're curious about a climate policy which is not as pessimistic as most in climate science and elsewhere about democracy, there's an effort to find a concrete answer to the question of how can policy look like which do not consider democracy as a threat to coping with consequences of climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.